You ever loved something so early that it got into your bones before you had the sense to be careful? I know that feeling personally. I was a kid with the soundtrack on repeat, watching every movie version I could get my hands on, sitting in the dark, obsessed by a man in a mask singing to a girl he never let go. And here's what nobody tells you when you're 12 years old, crying over the music of the night. A masked man luring a teenage girl into a basement he built specifically so she can't leave isn't a love story. It's a hostage situation with a killer score, even though I still romanticize about the Phantom of the Opera. So let's ask the real question before we go any further. What is it about a man who lives underground, stalks a young singer, murders the people who get in his way, and threatens to blow up a building when he doesn't get what he wants, that made generations of us swoon? Was it the music? Sure. Was it the tragedy? Absolutely. But underneath all of it sits something a lot more uncomfortable. We got trained early and often to hear I will never let you go as devotion instead of what it actually is, a threat with a melody attached. Erik isn't a misunderstood romantic hero who got a bad marketing edit. He's a case. Tonight I'm running an intake on him the way I run one on anyone who walked into my office with his history. By the end, you'll understand exactly why the version of you who loves him isn't wrong to feel something. It's just that nobody handed you the vocabulary for what you're actually looking at. And neither did I when I was younger. Tonight I'm handing it to you. Welcome to the Dominion. Let's start where the paper trail starts. Gaston Leroux published the original novel in 1910, serialized first in Paris newspaper, and the character was reportedly influenced in part by real accounts of disfigured men who lived and worked around the Paris Opera House. Leroux built the whole setting on real architecture too, which is part of why the story has haunted people for over a century. There's an actual underground lake beneath the Palais Garnier, the story's most famous set piece. The chandelier crashing onto the audience mid-performance was loosely inspired by a real 1893 accident where a falling calibrate killed a woman in the theater. LaRue took a genuinely haunting building and gave it a monster to match. Here's his origin. Erik is born disfigured, no accident or scarring later in life, nothing that would give the story a clean before and after. He's described as corpse like from the start, sunken eyes that show only skull like sockets, except when they catch the light. No nose, skin pulled tight and yellow over bone, wisps of black hair behind his ears, nowhere else. Language that novel usually saves for something already dead. The first person that whoever looked at his face was his mother, and she was horrified by him. His father, a master mason, apparently never looked at all. Erik himself, later in life, laments both of those facts specifically. Not being loved, not even being seen. Depending which version of his backstory we're working from, he gets sold off young into a traveling circus freak show, put on display as a curiosity for money by his own family. Whatever the exact path, the pattern holds steady across every version of him. The people who were supposed to protect him treated his existence like a problem to manage or a product to sell. Sit with that for a second, because this is where the sympathy comes from. And the sympathy is earned. There's real research on what happens to kids that grew up with visible facial differences. Adults disfigured in childhood can often trace their adult social anxiety back to specific incidents of early rejection and bullying, and the self protective habits they build then, flinching first, withdrawing before anyone else the chance. Don't stay contained childhood. They harden into the whole personality. A kid learns early that his face gets reaction before his voice does, and he spends the rest of his life either hiding the face or weaponizing everything else he's got. Attachment research on what maternal rejection does to a developing kid specifically. Children who experience early rejection from a primary caregiver show measurable differences in the brain region tied to reading other people's emotional cues. And they grow up worse at telling the differences between someone being kind to them and someone actually loving them. Given where the story ends up, that feels almost too precise. A man who can't distinguish kindness from love has a very specific kind of wound, and it has a very specific shape. So Eric grows up and he escapes the freak show life. Here's the part people skip past because it's less romantic than The Mask. He becomes brilliant architect, musician, magician, ventriloquist, engineer, allegedly building elaborate structures and even torture devices for actual regimes abroad before landing back in Paris. He crosses paths with a man named through most of the story only as the Persian or the Daroga, a former chief of police who becomes one of the only people alive who knows Eric's full history and tries on and off to keep him from destroying himself and everyone around him. Even the one person who could be called closest thing as a friend spends most of the story trying to contain him, then enjoying his company. That detail matters more than it gets credit for. Eric uses every bit of his genius to carve himself a hidden kingdom underneath the opera house. Secret passageways behind walls nobody else knows exist. A lake crossing that lets him move without being seen. A mirror torture chamber built specifically to disorient and overheat anyone he traps inside it. He didn't just hide inside the basement. He engineered the basement into a fortress built specifically so the outside world could never reach him again without his permission, and so that anyone that he decided to bring down there had no way back out without his say so. That's your intake. Rejected at birth, sold as a child, self taught into genius, and by adulthood completely alone by design, living in a home he built to keep every judging eye out for good. Then Christine walks in. She's a young singer at the opera, grieving her recently dead father, a violinist who used to tell her stories about an angel of music who would come to her one day and make her a great singer. Eric starts speaking to her through the walls of her dressing room, taking on that exact identity. He doesn't introduce himself as a man, he introduces himself as an answer to her grief, wearing her dead father's promise as a costume. For months, sometimes longer, depending on the adaptation, he trains her voice from behind the walls, and she has no idea that the angel is a living man 20 feet away, obsessed with her. That opening move has a clinical name, and we're getting to it. Symptoms. A diagnosis isn't a vibe, it's a pattern. And Eric's pattern is textbook once you stop listening to the violins. Symptom 1. The disguised approach. He doesn't meet Christian as himself, and that choice is deliberate, not shy. A man who could build a lake crossing under an opera house could absolutely find a way to introduce himself honestly if he wanted to. Instead, he builds an entire fictional identity around her most tender loss and lets her fall in love with a voice before she ever has the chance to consent to know whose voice it is. Real angels don't need aliases. People with something to hide use them constantly because a fake identity gets past every defense a person would normally raise against a total stranger, especially a grieving one. Symptom 2. Love bombing disguised as mentorship. Once the lessons start, Eric pours everything into her. total focus, and total praise. He tells her she's destined for greatness, that he chose her specifically, that no one else could ever teach her the way he can. She goes from an overlooked understudy to the best singer in the building, a prima donna, almost overnight. And every bit of that transformation gets credited to him. This is the exact shape of what's now well documented as love bombing, and an intense, overwhelming burst of attention and idealization early in a relationship that feels flattering in the moment and functions as a hook. It teaches the target that this specific person is the sole source of her success, her worth, voice, and itself, before she had any real chance to evaluate who he actually is. Symptom 3: isolation dressed up as devotion. Once Christine starts building a life outside of him, specifically once Raoul, her childhood friend, comes back into the picture as a romantic rival, Erik doesn't step back. He tightens his grip. He watches her constantly, from behind mirrors, through walls, from box survive, the seat in the theater he claims as his own by threat. He punishes anyone who threatens access to her. Joseph Bouquet, a stagehand who claims to have seen the opera Ghost with his own eyes, ends up dead, found hanging, and killing the novel leads deliberately ambiguous but heavily implies that Eric's doing. Jealousy on its own doesn't usually come with body count. Control does. If you've ever read anything about coercive control or heard my podcast, this should feel familiar. Isolating a partner from friends, family, rivals, everyone, monitoring their movements, punishing every pull toward the outside world. These show up as some of the most consistent features researchers find in controlling relationships. Whether the controller has a mask and a trapdoor or just a phone he checks it into in the morning. Symptom 4: love as ultimatum. Here's the detail that should end the debate for anyone still on the fence. In the climax, Erik kidnaps Christine, drags her down to his underground lair, and gives her a literal choice: marry him, or he detonates barrels of gunpowder he stockpiled beneath the opera house, killing everyone inside, Raoul included. Actually, hear that sentence: love me, or I'll destroy everything around you. A proposal built on a hostage countdown isn't passion, it's leverage with a ring attached. And it gets worse the closer you look. Erik himself knows Christine will only choose him under duress, and he says it much out loud. He's not deluded about whether this counts as real consent. He just wants her compliance more than he wants her actual feelings. And that tells you exactly what he's chasing. Never mutual love. Control that felt like love inside his head. Symptom 5: violence sitting right under the tenderness. Every adaptation softens this to a different degree, but the true line holds across all of them. Erik kills. He strangles men with a lasso, sometimes called upon a Punjab lasso, that he carries specifically for that purpose. A weapon he reportedly learned to use during his time working abroad. He grabs Christine, terrifies her, when she unmasks him against his wishes in a moment he never consented to, before the self-pity kicks back in seconds later, and the rage collapses into pleading. The tenderness and the violence run along the same nervous system, and the switch between them happens fast. If you've ever loved somebody who's volatile, you already know the scary part isn't the anger itself. It's how quickly the setting flips and how convincingly the softness sells itself as the real him once the storm passes. Symptom 6: collapse dressed as redemption. When Christine finally rejects him for real, mask off, worst behavior fully on display, still choosing Raoul over him, even with a bomb in the building, something in him shifts. In most versions, he lets her go, disappears, and dies alone not long after. Audiences read that as a monster finally tamed by love. Ask yourself what actually changed in him. His worldview, empathy, or did he simply just run out of leverage? Christine saw him completely and still chose someone else. Nothing was left to threaten his way out of. A person running out of tools isn't the same thing as a person growing new ones. And mistaking exhaustion for growth is exactly how this kind of ending gets misread as romantic instead of what it is, which is a standoff finally reaching its own possible conclusion. Symptom 7. Power on display dressed as spectacle. At the masked ball, Erik shows up uninvited, dressed as the Red Death, a plague figure straight out of Poe, and walks through a room full of people that have no idea. Most of them are standing near a killer. It's theater, and it's almost a warning shot. He's showing Christine and everyone else in that building exactly how easily he could walk among them unrecognized, exactly how much power he holds simply by choosing not to use it yet. Abusers escalate in private, but plenty of them also enjoy a public flex every now and then. A reminder to the person they're fixated on that there is nowhere they could go where they aren't potentially already standing. Christine's side of the file. I don't want to spend this whole video inside Eric's head because doing that quietly repeats the exact thing this story keeps doing to Christine. She gets treated as a mirror for his pain instead of a person with her own psychology. And that's worth naming directly. A lot of people reach for the term Stockholm Syndrome to explain why Christine keeps going back to that lake, and why she kisses him or shows him a flicker of tenderness even after everything. I want to be careful here because the actual research on Stockholm Syndrome is thinner than its pop culture reputation suggests. It came out of a single 1973 bank robbery in Sweden, and later reviews of the clinical literature had found remarkably little evidence behind it as reliable phenomena. It's a term that exploded in the public imagination faster than the science ever supported it. What does have real research behind it is trauma bonding, a well documented pattern where an intense emotional attachment forms specifically because of a repeating cycle, threat and fear, followed by unexpected kindness or relief over and over again until the nervous system starts associating the source of the danger with the source of the relief too. Christine spends the entire story locked in the exact cycle. Erik terrifies her, threatens the people she loves, kidnaps her, and then in the very next breath sings to her with a tenderness she's never received from anyone else, and lets her go at least at first. That whiplash, fear, then release, then fear, then is the precise mechanism trauma bonding research describes. Her flickers of sympathy for him aren't proof he deserved her love. They're proof the cycle he built around her was working exactly the way that kind of cycle is designed to work. Why we fell for him. Before the diagnosis, I want to answer the question that brought you here tonight because I promised you I would, and I meant it. Why did we love him? And why did I, at 12 years old, sit there aching for a man who does everything I just listed? Part of the answer is a documented psychological state called limerence, an involuntary obsessive fixation of another person built less around actually loving them and more around the desperate hope that they'll love you back. Researchers have found real correlations between limerence and anxiety. I talked about this in an obsession video. It's an attachment style that's tied specifically to early trauma and childhood abandonment. People who grew up with inconsistent affection Love that came with strings attached or vanished without warning are more likely to coat intensity itself as love later in life. If passion is in your house growing up meant chaos, your nervous system learns to read chaos as passion. Erik is chaos with a beautiful voice, which makes him one of the most efficient limerence triggers fiction has ever produced. The genre now has a name for exactly this appeal: dark romance, the whole modern shelf of morally gray, possessive, dangerous love interests sells on the promise that fiction lets you feel danger, control, intensity from somewhere completely safe. You get the adrenaline of being chosen by something powerful and unpredictable without any of the actual risks because he's on a page or a screen and not in your kitchen. That's not a shameful thing to want. It might even be a healthy outlet for it when it stays fiction. Erik is one of the original templates for that entire genre, over a century before anyone had a hashtag for it. And there is one more piece, the one that made him hit different than most of the other dangerous men in the horror and gothic canon. He was rejected first. He didn't choose cruelty out of boredom or appetite. He got made cruel by people who should have loved him and didn't. And something in a lot of us, especially the parts of us that have ever felt unlovable for reasons we didn't choose, hears that origin and thinks, I could have been the one that loved him right. I could have been the exception. That instinct is deeply human and deeply dangerous because it puts the entire burden of a violent man's healing onto the woman standing in front of him. Christine didn't sign up to fix him. Neither did any of us at 12, curled up with a soundtrack, quietly rehearsing the fantasy of being the one person who finally makes the monster gentle. The diagnosis. Let's name what we're actually looking at clinically, because Sad Man in a Mask is a marketing tagline, not a diagnosis. First piece. Eric's core wound is real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Minimizing it would make this whole analysis dishonest. A kid rejected by his mother for his face, sold into a life where his entire value was how strange he looked to strangers, tracks directly onto the research on early relational trauma. Children who live through that kind of primary caregiver rejection often grow into adults with serious attachment disruptions, real difficulty trusting affection when it's offered, and a nervous system permanently braced for the next withdrawal. That context matters. It explains where the wiring came from. It has zero say over what that wiring goes on to produce in adulthood. Second piece, and this is the one that explains the Christine fixation specifically. What Erik does once that he attaches to her lines up almost exactly like what clinicians describe as obsessive love and erotomania, a pattern where someone becomes fixated on a person, convinced the connection is more mutual than and more destined than the evidence actually supports. People caught in this pattern often carry insecure, preoccupied attachment styles underneath the intensity, along with the real terror of abandonment. Some clinical literature even frames it as a coping mechanism for older trauma, a way of finally giving unbearable grief a shape and a name and a mission. The chase was never really about Christine, the individual. It's an attempt to finally secure the unconditional love he never got the first time, aimed at whoever happened to be available when the wound was ready to reach for someone. She became proof he's been starving his whole life, wearing a young soprano's face. Third piece, the coercive control here isn't incidental, it's structural. Every tunnel and disguise, every hour spent watching her, the final ultimatum, all of it exists to strip away Christine's ability to choose freely. Genuine love can survive somebody else's no. Eric's version of love required removing her ability to say it in the first place. You can carry a real wound and still refuse to build a trap. Erik had the genius to build almost anything underneath that opera house. He chose the trap, and he chose it deliberately, brick by brick over years. Fourth piece, and the one people resist the hardest. A sympathetic backstory doesn't lower the danger. This is the whole reason this character keeps getting romanticized, generation after generation. Hey, I'm there. We hear his history and want so badly for the pain to explain everything away. Clinically, the person who could be legitimately wounded and legitimately dangerous at the exact same time, and neither fact cancels the other out. Eric's tragedy is real, so is the body count, and Christine's terror in that narrow room. Holding both truths at once is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is exactly why so many adaptations quietly drop the murders and keep the ballad. So here's the clean version. Erik carries legitimate history in early relational trauma, disfigurement based rejection. On top of that wound, he built an obsessive erotomania adjacent attachment to a woman he never actually had an honest relationship with. And he used love bombing, isolation, surveillance, and violence ultimatums, trying to force that attachment into being real. His backstory explains it. He doesn't clear him, but the fact that we wanting it too says less about Erik and more about us, about how many of us got taught early and often by 100 stories built just like this one that a man's pain can stand in for a woman's consent. That's the part that should actually unsettle you, not the mask, the training underneath your own reaction to it, the softening. Here's something worth knowing if you only grew up on the musical the way a lot of us did. Erik got gentler with every decade that passed, and that wasn't an accident. The 1925 silent film with Lon Chaney underneath makeup so unsettling that reports from the original screening describe audience members fainting in their seats, plays him as a fully monstrous, grotesque, dangerous, barely redeemable, closer to a slasher villain than a romantic lead. By the 1943 version, with Claude Rains, he's already softer, more of a tragic artist wronged by the industry than a predator. By the time Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical opens in 1986, he's got a soaring love theme, a genuinely gorgeous score, and a stage depth that reads as heartbreak instead of collapse. The 2004 film adaptation leans even more into romance, casting him young and classically handsome under the mask and giving the audiences a final shot of a single red rose on Christine's grave decades later, as if to insist the love, or whatever actually it was, mattered more than anything he did to get it. And have you seen the Robert England horror one? I like that one too. Watch that progression closely, and you're watching pop culture slowly retrain an entire audience, and then the next audience, and the next, and let's see what happens to the next, to read obsession as tragedy and tragedy as romance. Nobody sat in a boardroom and decided to do that on purpose. It happened because each version made a little more sympathetic than the last, chasing box office and ticket sales. And sympathy sells so much better than horror does. That's exactly how a stalker with a body count ends up as somebody's dream man by the time he reaches Broadway, the pattern he belongs to. Erik isn't alone in this. He's an early extreme entry in a much bigger family of stories, and knowing the family makes it easier to see clearly. Researchers studying relationship violence prevention actually have a name for this exact shape now. They call it the virgin beast trope, a recurring setup across centuries of romantic fiction where an innocent, often sheltered female lead ends up paired with a dangerous, powerful male figure, and the entire arc of the story asks her to tame him, save him, or simply just survive him long enough for the danger to soften into devotion. Beauty and the Beast, another favorite of mine, runs on this exact structure. So does a long line of stories that came after it, right up through plenty of what gets marketed as swoon worthy today. When researchers apply an actual abuse checklist to these narratives, threat, intimidation, isolation, stalking, they find the pattern lines up disturbingly well, even in the versions aimed at children. Erik and the Beast belong in the same lineage, and so does every brooding, dangerous love interest that comes after them, dressed in slightly newer clothes. The true line isn't a coincidence, and it isn't harmless. It's centuries old story structure that keeps teaching each new generation the same lesson before anyone is old enough to question it. Danger, if it's sad enough underneath, is worth staying for. That lesson lands especially hard on girls because it arrives early, wrapped in music and masks and cartoon castles, long before anyone hands them the word coercion to compare it against. None of it means that you have to feel guilty for loving the songs or the fandom or watching cartoons. I'm not saying that at all. Like, we have to watch everything. It just means the next time something in a story or your own life seems like devotion but behaves like control, you'll actually recognize which one you're looking at. Red scale. Time to rate it. On pure body count and physical horror, Eric's actually restraint next to some of the names we've covered in this Dominion. A handful of deaths, one attempted casual event that never goes through. That's not what it earns him the spot tonight. What earns him the spot is the psychological blueprint. Erik is one of the most clearest, earliest templates in Western pop culture for the fantasy that says, love him hard enough and he'll stop hurting people. And that fantasy has aged into a genuinely dangerous cultural script. It just shows up in real relationships and real stalking cases, real coercive control situation dressed in far less poetic language than in Andrew Lloyd's score. He also gave an entire modern genre a blueprint a century early without a single content warning attached. I'm putting Erik at a 7 out of 10 on the dread scale. And it's not because of what he does inside the story. It's because what he taught several generations for us before we had the tools to know better. The whole theme of the Phantom of the Opera and everything, 10 out of 10, because of course it's my favorite. If you loved him as a kid the way I did, you're not broken and you're not alone in it. You were handed a beautiful, dangerous piece of fiction with zero clinical vocabulary attached. Now you got it. Thank you for being here, and if horror feels like home, join the Dominion.